G'day. Here for Threatened Species Day, I'm going to speak about threatened species and the New South Wales Saving Our Species Program. Firstly, I acknowledge the 1,000 years of custodianship of this land by our First Nations people. Their connection to country means they have a long tradition of valuing it and taking care of it, and that's something we can all learn from. I would like to pay my respects to elders past, present and future, and extend that respect to any Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islands people who may be joining me for this presentation. My name is David Walker. I'm a team leader with the Ecosystems and Threatened Species team based in Dubbo. I work on the New South Wales Government's Saving Our Species Program. In my talk, I'm going to explain a little about the science around biodiversity and threatened species. Then I'm going to show you just how special and unique Australia's flora and fauna are. I will describe the Saving Our Species Program and then give a few examples of threatened species in our northwest and central west areas. And finally, I'll make some suggestions as to what we can all do to help. So first up, what is biodiversity? It is the variety of plants, animals, microorganisms and ecosystems that constitute our living environment. Biodiversity is important to humans for many reasons. Biodiversity is in the eye of the beholder. For some, it is our life support system. For others, it is a resource to be used. For others, it is a precious cultural symbol. Biodiversity is considered by many to have intrinsic value. That is, each species has a value and a right to exist, whether or not it is known to have value to humans. The CSIRO has published a biodiversity book, and it describes 5 core and interacting values that humans place in biodiversity. Economic. Biodiversity provides humans with raw materials for consumption and production. Many livelihoods, such as those of farmers, fishers and timber workers, are dependent on biodiversity. Ecological life support. Indirect but very practical values include the maintenance of ecosystem services or important ecological processes. Examples include supplying oxygen, clean air and water, maintaining water quality in catchments, moderating atmospheric processes and weather, conserving the structure or fertility of soil, assimilating or removing waste from water or soil, maintaining evolutionary potential in ecosystems, sequestering carbon emissions, cycling of nutrients, pest control, and the pollination of crops. Recreation. Many recreational pursuits rely on our unique biodiversity, such as bird watching, bushwalking, camping and fishing. Our tourism industry also depends on biodiversity. The Great Barrier Reef has been a huge contributor of income from overseas visitors who come specifically to visit it. Cultural. The Australian culture is closely connected to biodiversity through the expression of identity, through spirituality and through aesthetic appreciation. Indigenous Australians have strong connections and obligations to biodiversity arising from spiritual beliefs about animals and plants. Scientific. Biodiversity represents a wealth of systematic ecological data that help us to understand the natural world and its origins. Australians have long had a sense that our biodiversity is special, but despite our sense of its importance, in many parts of our country, biodiversity is in trouble. An ecological community is the unique suite of plants, animals and microorganisms that occupy and interact within the same geographical space. Each ecological community is adapted to occur in a particular habitat type, usually determined by the area's biophysical characteristics, its climate, its geology and consequent soil types, its position in the landscape and the availability of water. Superimposed over this are the complex interactions and interdependencies between the various species present in terms of food webs, what eats what, shelter, what lives in or on what, and breeding opportunities. So every ecological community is different. The ironbark woodland of the Goonoo State Conservation Area near Dubbo is very different to the semi-arid shrubland of the far west of New South Wales, which itself is a huge contrast to the rugged landscapes of eastern Tasmania. Examples of ecological communities in this area, there are the general landscape types such as a mile woodland or the white box, yellow box, Blakely's red gum woodland, or the inland grey box woodland. or they can be specialised and localised. Native vegetation on cracking clay soils of the Liverpool Plains is one, or another is the Nunes Plateau shrub swamp. What does threatened species mean? It means the species is at risk of becoming extinct. A species is considered threatened if its population is declining, it has a restricted geographical distribution, meaning that a catastrophic event in that area could wipe them out, or there are few mature individuals, making it hard for the population to breed and self-replace. If the risk is high, they are listed in legislation and conservation actions are developed for their protection. There are 4 levels of threat: vulnerable, endangered, critically endangered, or presumed extinct. I don't think most of us realise just how special Australia's flora and fauna is. This little fellow is the yellow-footed rock wallaby. The yellow-footed rock wallaby was once found in small, separate colonies throughout the semi-arid range country in northern South Australia, western New South Wales and southwest Queensland. Population numbers were drastically reduced following European settlement, with many colonies becoming extinct. The only colony still found in New South Wales is on the stony hills around Mutawinji, east of Broken Hill. Australia is one of 17 countries described as being megadiverse, based on the total number of species and the uniqueness of those species. They are endemic to the country. This group of countries has less than 10% of the global surface, but supports more than 70% of the biological diversity on Earth. These countries are, on the African country, the Congo, South Africa, Madagascar, mainland Asia, India and China, coming down Malaysia, Indonesia, the Philippines, Papua New Guinea, Australia, to our east, the United States and Mexico, and Peru, Ecuador, Colombia, Venezuela, and Brazil. Australians have long had a sense that our biodiversity is special. Scientifically, our biodiversity is highly regarded for its endemism, its diversity, and evolutionary adaptations, but it's also an inseparable part of our culture. Around 150,000 species have been formally described in Australia, but this is only about 25% of the total number present. Every year, new species are identified. Many species, such as insects, remain largely undiscovered. When compared with other countries, Australia has very high levels of endemism, that is, the species only found in Australia. 84% of our flowering plants, 83% of mammal species, 45% of our birds, 94% of our amphibians, and 93% of reptiles are found nowhere else. In terms of our fauna, we stand head and shoulders above every other country. This chart shows the known number of animal species in each of those 17 megadiverse countries. Australia is across on the left, and the bar graph shows the number of endemic vertebrate species. Vertebrate species are animals that have backbones, as distinct from insects, snails, worms, etc. Australia has 1.5 times the number of vertebrate animal species of any other country. The blue at the bottom represents mammals. We have most there. On top of that in black is the number of bird species. The white part of the bar chart represents reptiles. We have about twice as many reptile species as any other country. In the grey at the top are the amphibians, the frogs. The marine environment, the sea surrounding us, is home to thousands of marine species, and many of those are unique to Australia. This includes at least 45 species of whales, dolphins and porpoises. All of this makes Australia the most biodiversity-rich, developed country in the world. In terms of plants, we are way up there also. On this chart, we are 5th from the left. While we don't have more species than several of these countries, our range of habitats, from alpine to rainforest to desert and everything in between, means that our variety of plant habitats, and hence the species that live in them, is just amazing. So why is Australia's flora and fauna so unique? It's because we're an island, and because there have been millions of years of isolation in which evolution has taken our species down a very individual path. Australia has an evolutionary distinct flora and fauna, including many paleoendemics, Paleo meaning very ancient, and as we've already established, endemic means they're found nowhere outside Australia. These paleo-endemics have an ancient lineage associated with the Australian continent going right back to when we were part of the ancient Gondwana supercontinent. Some of these are the few remaining species surviving from ancient times. For example, gymnosperms such as the pencil pine and the Wallaby pine. The Wallaby was here and widespread 200 million years ago. Until 1994, it was only known from fossils and thought to have disappeared about 100 million years ago. Here is the hidden valley in Wallaby National Park where the Wallaby pines are located. As we can see, the area above the valley was burnt to a crisp in the 2019 bushfires. The saving of the Wallaby Grove from those bushfires was quite heroic. Australians have long had a sense that biodiversity is special, but despite our sense of its importance, in many parts of our country, biodiversity is in trouble. Since European settlement, more than 50 species of Australian animals and over 60 species of Australian plants are known to have become extinct. Across the country, more than 1,700 species and ecological communities are known to be threatened and at risk of extinction. The key threats to a species are loss, degradation and fragmentation of habitat. I quote from a federal government report. Land clearance destroys biodiversity. The clearance of native vegetation results in the loss and depletion of plant species and destroys the habitat for thousands of other species. For example, it is estimated that 1,000 to 2,000 birds permanently lose their habitat for every 100 hectares of woodland that is cleared, while the clearing of woodland for cropping kills, on average, more than 85% of the resident reptiles and more than 200 individual reptiles per hectare. Native vegetation supports many of the critical ecosystem services that I spoke about earlier. Pollinators, stabilising soil, but most importantly, they provide the habitat for Australia's biodiversity. Clearing, including clearing of regrowth, destroys that habitat and reduces landscape resilience. Invasive species. Our wildlife has been killed by cats and foxes, poisoned by cane toads, and habitat is destroyed by feral pigs and goats, and crowded out by foreign weeds. Ordered fire regimes. Fire frequencies have increased in Australia during the past 2 decades. These have contributed to the extinction of 6 mammal species and is a significant pressure on 35 other threatened mammals. Other threats include unsustainable use and management of natural resources, changes to the aquatic environment and water flows, and climate change. Of the 17 countries containing large endowments of biodiversity, Australia is privileged in another very significant way. Of all the countries classified as megadiverse, Australia is one of only 2 countries in the high income category. Australia, as a richer, healthier, better educated country with a more developed economy, is better positioned to deal with problems of environment and development than all but one other megadiverse nation, the USA. These 2 countries have per capita incomes at least 2.5 times all of the other 15 countries. This position carries a special responsibility and implies that a high standard of biodiversity protection can be expected in Australia. It also carries with it an opportunity for world leadership. You might be surprised to learn that, compared to Australia, the US has about twice as much of its landmass reserved in national parks and the like. Now I'll talk about the Saving Our Species Program. Can you imagine New South Wales without our beautiful flora and fauna? This grass is Belson's panic, Homophilus belsonii. It's found in small numbers across drier woodland habitat, for example, Balar country, on the black soils across the northwest plains of New South Wales and just up into southern Queensland. We all know our natural environment is what makes New South Wales so special, loved by us and visited by people from all over the world. But many of the iconic plants and animals that call New South Wales home are at risk of extinction. Saving Our Species is trying to do something about this. It aims to deliver practical conservation action to save as many threatened New South Wales plants and animals as possible. To do this, we all need to be doing our bit. There are more than 1,000 species and ecological communities threatened with extinction in New South Wales. At our current trajectory, 43%, or more than 430, of these species will be extinct, gone forever, in 100 years. We know we are constrained by limited resources, data, knowledge, and capacity. So the question is how to optimally allocate resources to maximise the species and communities so that they're secure from extinction. Saving Our Species aims to maximise the number of threatened species that can be secured in the wild in New South Wales for 100 years. Given limited resources, we have to walk a fine line, maximising the number of species that can be secured with the minimum number of sites and actions we're working on to succeed in securing them. Saving Our Species, SOS, supports on-ground action for about 450 species and ecological communities across more than 1,000 sites. It is one of the largest on-ground conservation programs in Australia. This equates to action for more than 40% of New South Wales threatened species, threatened populations, and threatened ecological communities. For comparison, at the Commonwealth level, the Environment Protection and Biodiversity Conservation Act lists nearly 1,700 species, but the national framework provides on-ground action for 70 of those species, or just 4% of them. So what is Saving Our Species? It is New South Wales' flagship threatened species conservation program, providing a common framework for conservation across government and other partners. The first commitment of $100 million across 5 years has been from 2016 to 2021 and is now complete. We are now starting the next program, $75 million over the next 5 years to 2026. So how does it work? It's thorough. It consults extensively with experts and applies independent peer-reviewed science to species, populations of a species, and ecological communities projects. It takes a rigorous and transparent approach to prioritising investment in projects that ensure benefit to the maximum number of species. It provides targeted conservation projects that set out the actions required to save specific plants and animals on mapped management sites. It regularly monitors the effectiveness of projects so they can be improved over time. It provides annual report cards on threatened species where actions are underway, and it encourages partnerships with community, corporate and government in threatened species conservation by providing a website and a database with information on project sites, volunteering opportunities and research opportunities. What are these 1,000 threatened species? They're comprised of 29 amphibians, and they are all frogs, remembering there are no native toads in Australia. 46 reptiles, being turtles, snakes and lizards, 225 birds, 80 mammals, 11 insects and 641 plants. And there are 108 threatened ecological communities, TECs. There are 32 range-restricted TECs, for example, the Xanthopomelia lichen community, which only occurs on Mount Canobolas near Orange. There are 78 widespread TECs. For example, the white box, yellow box, Blakely's red gum woodland. This is the widespread landscape of the Western Slopes, much of which has been cleared and comprise much of the sheep wheat belt. To organise the program so that it addresses the particular characteristics of each species, threatened species are assigned to 6 streams. There are site-managed species. These are threatened plants and animals that can be secured by conservation projects at specific sites. Almost half of all threatened species in New South Wales are best managed at this level. They're mostly plants. Granite Zieria has 1 site near Wellington, 1 near Bathurst. The Janolan pea is at only 1 site in the Blue Mountains. It's in such low numbers that we have taken seeds to the Mount Annan Botanic Garden near Campbelltown to make sure it can be secured. The green hood orchid is found on a stock route below Warra. Site-managed species also include some animals of a very restricted range. The red-lord whistler in the Mallee of Western New South Wales, the beach stone curlew, and the eastern bristlebird. This stream allows critical threats at the particular site to be managed, such as predators, or perhaps weeding, controlling erosion, or some revegetation. Landscape managed species. These need broad landscape scale conservation projects. They are best assisted by addressing threats such as habitat loss or degradation within a landscape. This is because these species are often widely distributed, albeit in low numbers, or they're highly mobile or dispersed, or they're affected by landscape scale threats. Ways of dealing with threats to landscape managed species include replanting or weeding as part of broad-scale vegetation and habitat management programs, reducing land clearing, sharing water to sustain floodplain ecosystems, managing national parks and reserves. These species are mostly bats and birds, but there are also gliders, frogs and snails. The iconic species. These are highly valued by the community. They're important socially, culturally and economically, and the community expects them to be effectively managed and protected. There are 6 iconic species: the koala, the brush-tailed rock wallaby, the southern corroboree frog, the Mallard Foul, the Wallaby pine and the plains wanderer. These projects are based on existing recovery plans and consultation with experts and the community. Data deficient species. There's insufficient knowledge to properly develop a management response. We don't know enough about their life history, their distribution, or the threats to their survival. Examples of these are the night parrot, the spike rush, and the peppered tree frog. Or we don't even know if these species are still here. This group includes 72 species presumed extinct, the bilby and the eastern quoll, for example. Partnership species are threatened species found mainly in the other states and territories. Less than 10% of their population is in New South Wales. The future of these species depends on populations outside New South Wales, so we partner with others to protect them. Examples include the brolga and the yellow-footed rock wallaby. Keep watch species. No immediate action is needed to protect them. They're naturally rare and have few threats, or perhaps they're more common than we once thought. The sooty tern and the shrub Acacia ruppii are 2 examples. Unless threats increase or there is evidence that populations are declining, funds are better spent on more at-risk species. I work in the northwest region of New South Wales. It's nearly 500,000 square kilometres, the area shown in yellow on this map. It comprises 25 local council areas and more than half the area of New South Wales. We work on 30 site managed species in this region. There's 1 landscape managed species, the barking owl. 3 iconic species have projects in our area: Mallard Foul, brush-tailed rock wallaby and the koala. There's 1 data deficient species, the eastern quoll, 1 partnership species, the yellow-footed rock wallaby, 1 threatened ecological community, the Janelle and Heath. We also have a major role with 4 externally led projects. There's a BirdLife Australia project, Birds on Farms, re-ageing the temperate woodlands of central west New South Wales. Mid-Lachlan Landcare has their white box, yellow box Blakely's red gum woodland habitat on farms project. There's a Burralong Frog project. Our partners there are Local Land Services Central Tablelands, the Australian Museum and the Taronga Zoo. And there's an Environmental Trust project, Making Central Inland Glossies Great Again. Our partners there are Central West Local Land Services, Dubbo Field Naturalists and Conservation Society, Landcare, the Forestry Corporation of New South Wales and the National Parks and Wildlife Service. Now I'm going to show you just a few examples of the captivating species that live in our region, but we're in danger of losing if we don't take action to protect them and the places where they live. But first, let's reflect on why biodiversity is important. Not just because we have wonderful flora and fauna that is admired all around the world, but also because our biodiversity underpins and strengthens our farming systems. I quote from the Central West Local Land Services. Ecosystems that are rich in biodiversity are more resilient and healthy and are better able to withstand and recover from outside stresses such as drought, pests, wildfire and climate change. This magnificent bird is the glossy black cockatoo. I mentioned the Making Central Inland Glossies Great Again project in the previous section. They feed on the cones of she oak trees and shrubs and need to nest in large hollows in older eucalypts. Both these natural assets are declining, and consequently so are the glossies. I also referred earlier to the huge area my colleagues and I are working on, 55% of New South Wales. For our look at the threatened species across this huge area, I'll break it up a bit by looking at the 4 local land service regions we straddle. In the central part of our 55% is the Central West Local Land Services region. As you can see on the map, it stretches from Coonamble and Coonabarabra in the north, through Dubbo, Parks and Forbes to Grenfell in the south, and out to Lake Kajelica and Ningen in the west. There have been 117 threatened species recorded in this region. 2 frogs, 3 reptiles, 54 birds, 17 mammals, 41 plants, and as well there are 28 endangered ecological communities. I'm only going to pick a representative few. A reptile candidate is the pink-tailed legless lizard. But first, to explain the little red triangles on the map. They denote the locations where the particular species has been sighted, identified and recorded. When a scientist, or you as a community member who is interested in the wildlife or vegetation in any area, see and recognise any species, you can record the location and enter your sighting into the New South Wales Wildlife Atlas, known as BioNet. If getting involved in this interests you, your contribution would be most welcome. The pink-tailed legless lizard is also known as the pink-tailed worm lizard. They're not a worm because they have a backbone. The broad, non-forked tongue, frequently used to wipe the eyes, and the presence of small hind limb flaps distinguishes it from a juvenile snake. It inhabits sloping ground, open woodland areas with rocky outcrops, and predominantly native grassy ground layers, particularly those dominated by kangaroo grass. Sites are typically well drained, with rocky outcrops or scattered, partially buried rocks. Commonly found beneath small, partially embedded rocks, they appear to spend considerable time in burrows below these rocks. The burrows have been constructed by and are often still inhabited by small black ants and termites. They feed on the larvae and eggs of the ants, with which it shares its burrows. It is thought that this species lays 2 eggs inside the ant's nest during summer, and the young first appear in March. The threats: habitat loss and fragmentation as land is cleared, rocks removed and the land is cultivated, or being killed by cats and dogs. Actions: conserve grassy woodland habitat and restrain cats and dogs. The Regent Honeyeater used to be seen in flocks of thousands from Adelaide to southeast Queensland. Sadly, its range has contracted dramatically in the last 30 years, and the population now only numbers a few hundreds in total. Only 3 known key breeding regions remain: south of Albury, the Capity Valley to the east of us here, and the Bundarra-Barraba region in northern New South Wales. Their records in this region indicate their forays to the west looking for food. The Regent Honeyeater is critically endangered. Threats facing this species include loss of key habitat tree species and remnant woodlands, loss of paddock trees and increasing fragmentation of small vegetation remnants, and competition from larger aggressive honeyeaters, particularly noisy miners. The actions: we're maintaining a captive population of Regent honeyeaters. They're bred in this region at Taronga Western Plains Zoo. Captive bred birds are released in the spring to augment the wild population. The other action is to protect and enhance key breeding and foraging habitats. The barking owl population crashed as woodland on fertile soils was cleared over the past century, leaving only strips of remnant trees along creeks and rivers as the last inhabitable areas. Nowadays, the owls sometimes extend their home range into urban areas, hunting birds in garden trees and insects attracted to streetlights. The largest population in southern Australia is in the Pilliga area, as confirmed by the concentration of records north of Coonamble and Coonabarabra on this map. It preferentially hunts small arboreal, tree-living mammals such as squirrel gliders and common ringtail possums. These 2 species require tree hollows for their breeding, so when loss of tree hollows decreases the prey populations, the owl becomes more reliant on birds, invertebrates and terrestrial mammals such as rodents and rabbits, or they leave the area altogether. Actions: protect woodland and open forest remnants, especially those containing hollow-bearing trees. Retain and enhance vegetation along watercourses and surrounding areas to protect important habitat of the owls and the prey. It's surprising just how widespread koalas are in this region. They are quite mobile across landscapes, looking for new habitat areas, but they are often unable to settle and thrive. Clearly, there have been significantly more of them to the north of the region, in the Warrumbungles and Pilliga. Sadly, the huge wildfires in the Warrumbungles in 2013 decimated the population there, and in the Pilliga, drought and heat waves have taken their toll. Koalas are one of Australia's most iconic animals, recognisable around the world. Indeed, they are one of the 6 iconic species I referred to earlier. Koalas benefit the Australian economy. It has been estimated that they create over 9,000 jobs and contribute between $1.1 billion and $2.5 billion per year to tourism in Australia. The koala has suffered a dramatic decline in numbers and distribution since the arrival of Europeans. They face increasing threats from urban expansion, disease, habitat loss, vehicle strike and predation by dogs, and from their susceptibility to drought and climate change. The Squirrel Glider is widely, though sparsely distributed in eastern Australia, from northern Queensland to western Victoria. West of the Great Dividing Range, it inhabits mature or old-growth box ironbark woodlands and river red gum forests. It prefers mixed species stands with a shrub or acacia mid-story. They live in family groups of a single adult male, one or more adult females, and their offspring. They require abundant tree hollows for refuge and nest sites. Actions: retain and protect old-growth forests containing hollow-bearing trees and den trees. Rare in the central tablelands and western slopes of New South Wales, the fairy bell grows in woodland habitats with shrubby understories, usually in gravelly sandy soils. Its concentration in the Gnu State Conservation Area north of Dubbo shows the importance of the reserve system to conserve rare plants. Threats: localised extinction. They're susceptible to catastrophic events such as fire, clearing and logging due to the small population size and its extent. They're also susceptible to grazing by livestock, goats and rabbits. Actions: protect from grazing damage. Granite Zieria grows in open eucalypt woodland or acacia shrubland on rocky granite hillsides. There are only 2 sites, one near Wellington in this region and one near Bathurst to the southeast. Threats: grazing by sheep and cattle, kangaroos and wallabies, and feral animals such as goats and rabbits. They're also subject to choking out by aggressive weeds. Actions: fencing to protect and weed control. Here is one of Australia's most fascinating birds. The Mallard Foul is a large ground-dwelling bird with excellent hearing and eyesight, enabling it to detect danger. When threatened, it will sneak away, relying on camouflage. Although they were originally found widely throughout Australia, Mallard Foul are now mostly limited to areas of inland semi-arid scrub. They used to be regularly seen in the Gnu State Conservation Area just north of Dubbo, but in recent years, sightings are rare. They incubate eggs in large mounds that contain considerable volumes of sandy soil, using composting vegetation to generate heat. The male monitors the temperature within the egg chamber using its bill and regularly works the mound during the breeding season to maintain a constant temperature around 34 degrees, removing and adding the soil compost mixture as required. While the male is keeping the temperature of the mound constant, the female is busy laying eggs and helping with the digging. Generally, an egg is laid every 4 to 8 days. A female Mallard Foul lays between 15 and 24 eggs in a season, though the number will depend on the availability of food. Mallard Foul parents abandon the nest before their eggs have hatched. Chicks hatch and begin a solitary life independent of their parents, relying on camouflage for defence against foxes and other predators. Here is one very strong reason that the Mallard Foul is vulnerable. Foxes and pigs will dig up the eggs and prey upon emerging chicks. This is one of the main reasons that they have all but disappeared from the Gnu just north of Dubbo. Once widespread in the grassy understories of woodlands and open forests of the western slopes, now there are only small populations of the small purple pea in the Wellington Mudgee area and near Queanbeyan. Plants die back in summer, surviving as a rootstock until they shoot again in autumn. They're generally tolerant of fire, which also enhances germination by breaking the seed coat, and it reduces competition from other species. Threats include grazing and trampling by cattle, sheep and goats, clearing for farming, weed invasion, and reduced fire frequency. A healthy population of bats is vital for the control of insect pests in a number of food crops and in cotton. The distribution of Corbin's long-eared bat coincides approximately with the Murray-Darling Basin, with the Pilliga being the distinct stronghold for this species, as can be seen from the concentration of records above Coonabarabran and Coonamble. Threats: loss of remnants, semi-arid woodland and mallee habitat, loss of hollow-bearing trees. The actions are to retain those woodland and mallee vegetations and to retain hollow-bearing trees and provide for hollow tree recruitment. The range of the brush-tailed rock wallaby used to extend from southeast Queensland to the Grampians in Western Victoria, roughly following the line of the Great Dividing Range. However, the distribution of the species across its original range has declined significantly. Brush-tailed rock wallabies occupy rocky escarpments, outcrops and cliffs, with a preference for complex structures with fissures, caves and ledges, often facing north. They shelter or bask during the day in rock crevices, caves and overhangs, and are most active at night, when they leave their shelter to feed. Threats: predation by foxes and wild dogs, competition with feral goats, and loss, degradation and fragmentation of habitat. The records shown on this map show the population in the Warrumbungle Ranges, which used to be the western limit of the population. Sadly, these records are all prior to 2006. They've been locally extinct since then. If you want to find out more about the Saving Our Species program, here are a number of websites with further information. Follow the links. Here are a few tips about what we can all do. Educate yourself and others. This is one of the most essential conservation methods. If we don't know about it, we probably won't value it. By learning about wildlife, you are better able to understand the importance of these endangered species and the resources needed for their survival. This can either be learning about the wildlife in your local neighbourhood or more broadly across Australia. You can then educate friends, family and neighbours by providing information and enthusiasm in respect of all sorts of local and global species. Educating yourself can include activities such as visiting a wildlife refuge or national park. Remember, when you're in the bush, leave only footprints, take only photos. You can get involved in volunteering. Observe the plants and animals around you. Join the local land care or river care group, or one of the other environmental groups. These groups provide the opportunity to do all sorts of things around learning about your local environment and undertaking important habitat restoration works. In many areas, these groups have already transformed local environments, seeing native flora and fauna make a comeback. And it's a great way to get exercise and make new friends. I'll give a special call out to Ozfish. It has turned weekend fishermen into environmentalists, and the rivers are healthy and the fishing better. Create a natural habitat in your backyard. Look at plants that are native to your region and help create a backyard sanctuary for local birds and other wildlife. Put some bird baths and feeders in your yard, or put up some nesting boxes. Get rid of weeds. What seems like a perfectly harmless plant can turn into a noxious weed if it jumps your back fence and heads into bushland. Introduced plants are an acute and insufficiently appreciated ecological problem. On a national scale, populations of the most invasive species are expanding. Plant species not native to Australia now account for about 15% of our total flora. About half of them invade native vegetation, and about 1/4 are regarded as serious environmental weeds or have the potential to be serious weeds. The largest proportion of environmental weeds are horticultural species that have escaped from cultivation. Check out what's considered a weed in your part of the country and how to control it. Search Weeds Australia or go to weeds.org.au. Be a responsible pet owner. If you can no longer keep your pet, do not release it into the wild. This includes pet fish. Do not flush them down the toilet or put them into local streams. Make sure your cat is desexed and either keep it indoors or invest in an outdoor cat run. Domestic cats have a devastating effect on local wildlife. Reduce, reuse and recycle. Look at ways to reduce the amount of rubbish that ends up in landfill and the waterways. Many things can now be recycled. Make sure you are conscientious in sorting your waste. For more information on what you can recycle in your local area, search Recycling Near You or Waste and Recycling. You may have organic waste collection in your town. If you don't, start your own compost bin or worm farm. Organic matter like vegetable peelings, which usually end up in landfill, is great for your garden. Start composting and you can reduce the need for chemicals and fertilizers in your garden and improve the health of your soil. Monitor your chemical usage and only put water down the drains. Things like oils and chemicals may start at the kitchen sink but end up in our waterways and seas and can affect animals and plants living in streams and rivers. Instead of using commercial cleaning chemicals, try using white vinegar and bicarb of soda. When you're in the bush, treasure it. Sit and soak up the spirituality. Tell your political representatives that you want our flora and fauna to be better protected. Our politicians all have the opportunity to be seen to be supportive of nature. Hold them to it. I quote from the Australian government's most recent State of the Environment. The outlook for Australia's biodiversity is generally poor. Given the current overall poor status, deteriorating trends and increasing pressures, our current investments in biodiversity management are not keeping pace with the scale and magnitude of current pressures. Resources for managing biodiversity and for limiting the key impact of key pressures mostly appear inadequate to arrest the declining status of many species. Biodiversity and broader conservation management will require major reinvestments across long time frames to reduce deteriorating trends. Tell your local politicians and ask them to fix it. We share Earth with the living world, the most remarkable life support system imaginable, constructed over billions of years. The planet's stability has wavered, just as its biodiversity has declined. The two things are bound together. To restore stability to our planet, therefore, we must restore its biodiversity, the very thing we have removed. It is the only way out of this crisis that we ourselves have created. We must rewild the world. Thank you, David Attenborough.